Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the Communications Specialist with the Center for Ag Profitability. And as always, we want to remind you, you can find all of our center's resources, including a schedule of webinars and all of our webinar recordings for the past 5 years or so on our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu. And today, we're glad to be talking about the topic of seed selection, which is one of the most critical decisions that farmers make every year, and it certainly has significant implications for profitability. Today, we're glad to have presenting with us ag economist and extension educator Shannon Sand and ag economics specialist Matt Stockton. They're going to explore economic insights related to corn hybrid selection using examples from the TAPS contest that takes place where they are in North Platte. The examples will demonstrate the importance of hybrid selection and differences that they can make on profitability as they present key findings from an in-depth analysis of the TAPS competition in 2018. And we definitely invite any questions that you have to be typed into the chat box or the Q&A as we go, and we will work to get those answered before we wrap up today. And before you leave, we hope that you'll learn about some of the key points to consider as you're making your seed selection choices, recognizing costs versus returns, avoiding some pitfalls, and applying a value-driven approach to hybrid seed selection. So again, I want to thank Shannon Sand, Ag Economics Extension Educator, and Ag Economist Specialist, Dr. Matt Stockton, for joining us to present today, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. We appreciate it. So kind of like Ryan said, we're going to talk about maximizing profit through seed selection. So this, I should say, is an idea started by Matt, and we've kind of talked about it and developed it through this, but I'm pretty excited. How about you, Matt?
I'm very excited, but I don't want anybody to get the idea that I think that you're out buying your seed right now. Most of you probably bought your seed like
last year
or fall.
Yeah.
Now, some of you still may be buying, but these are important concepts, and so from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So go ahead, Shannon.
You have the slides.
I know, but what do you want to do next?
Next slide, sir.
You wanted to forward. There we go.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
So I didn't know you wanted me to move forward. I'd have done it.
Sorry. It's like, yes. So basically what we did is introduce 3 factors of comparison, and then using those factors, which we'll talk about a little later, to make a comparison. And we use TAPS data in order to do that. It's the sprinkler irrigated corn contest that takes place here in North Platte. This is specifically the 2018 year. So I think we need to state that it's specifically related to that year. Everybody knows weather can change a lot. So, but we were really shocked and surprised at just the amount of variation among hybrids and just the cultural practices that are done. So, Matt, anything else?
Yeah, actually, I do want to comment on that just for briefly. You know, I've been doing TAPS 8 or 9 years, whatever it is, maybe whatever, between 7 and 10 years somewhere. Anyway, because I've kind of lost track. But the idea is, what really shocked me and has actually surprised me, if you will, is that there is so much difference in the way people go about farming, which I think is fantastic. I just wasn't expecting as much variation in the performance of hybrids, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this talk, is that there's huge differences in the way the hybrids perform, and even with different culture practices, it's just amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool to see.
Okay. So what is the value difference between hybrids? The first thing we're going to do, Shannon, is what?
Calculate the difference in the cost of buying and seeding the different hybrids.
Right. And then, okay, so that would be the number one thing you want to do. In other words, seed cost 1 costs so much, seed cost 2, seed 2 is so much. Okay, right. And then if there's a difference in the populations or whatever you do, you got to account for that cost. So that's the planting cost, right? That's the initial cost. Then the next thing we're going to do is we have to identify cultural differences between the hybrids.
Right.
And this might happen like in a case of growing 2 different, like a conventional corn versus maybe a high-tech corn. that maybe a triple stack or something like that. Well, you may have to have include some spray or herbicide differences. And so during the production cycle, if you're going to do it culturally different. Now, if you're going to grow both exactly the same, then you don't have to worry about that because the cost is going to be the same, regardless of which variety you, no, I'm sorry, hybrid that you select. My agronomist would be mad at me for me saying variety. It's a hybrid. Okay. And the last thing, Shannon, is what?
To account for any differences in productivity using its expected value. So kind of making sure we're looking at apples to apples rather than apples to oranges.
Right. So, nobody, somebody's eating an orange and somebody's eating an apple. Trust me, they might have.
It's very different.
Right. And so we can't do that. We want to make sure that the comparison is fair. And that's one of the reasons why the TAP data actually worked out to be a great thing to use because here we have crops planted on the same field at the same time. The year is the same, everything's the same, they're on the same field. The only difference is in the hybrid type and the and the culture. Some maybe there will be differences in the amount of water and stuff, which we need to talk about in a minute, but let's move on.
Yep. So that first hybrid value comparison that we looked at was just that cost of planting difference, like Matt said. So for an example, hybrid 1, let's say it cost $100 an acre versus hybrid 2 cost $120. So hybrid 1 is $20 an acre cheaper to plant, right? So pretty simple way to look at it.
Right, and we don't want to insult you by giving you such a simple example. We hope that all this does is to help you understand that this is the first simple thing you should consider. And I think some people may consider it too much, and some people may not consider it enough. It just depends on how that all works out for them. And then we're going to talk about the cost difference of the seed and how that affects the ending bottom line. And we're going to go through that process.
Yep.
So we did that. We did that for 20 of the fields. There's a lot of numbers here, but don't let the numbers scare you. They don't bite. I've defanged every single one of them, and they don't have any venom. And but basically, we took these 20 competitors from North Platte, and you'll notice that the farm numbers 1 to 20. The ones in red were actually the same. If you look at the hybrid number,
they're the same number.
The A1, they're the same variety. That's not variety, same hybrid. Sorry. And then the other ones like B1, B2, and B3, and B11 and 10, and all those 9, they all represent a different hybrid. And then what we have there is the actual seed cost. So this like $94 for one, and then, but now number 12, who is also the same hybrid, costs more. Well, why? Because it's got more population. It's got 1,000 more seeds planted per acre, and so that accounts for the
a little bit
difference
more
in the cost. So if you look at those numbers, don't let that disturb you. So let's take the B1, which is a farm number 2, and they paid $74.43 an acre to plant their hybrid.
Right.
Wow. So compared to the farm 1, which cost $94.95, I mean, you're talking like $22.53 difference, or close to it. Actually, the 90, yes, that. So basically, if B1 had planted the A1 variety, it would have cost them $22.53 more than if they planted their current variety. And so each one of that does that. It goes through that. So there's farms in here that are actually paid a lot more. Like let's take farm 7. They paid $120 an acre to plant their hybrid versus they could have planted the A1 hybrid for $23.09. And so we took that difference. And so that's that first cost thing. And we did it for every single farm. So some of them were negative, some of them were positive. So you could say they're winners or losers, but we really don't know that yet.
We don't know at this point is really what it all comes down to.
Right. All we know is that you paid something different for that variety. The question is, how did it all work out for you in the end? And that's really where it counts, right? It doesn't, I mean, you can buy cheap seed, and if it doesn't perform well, you may have a problem. And that's kind of, we're going to get to that. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Sounds great. So the second is the cultural differences, kind of like Matt spoke about earlier. So what are those differences in in growing the two hybrids? In other words, hybrid 1 and hybrid 2 in this case have similar seed technology and don't require any sort of cultural differences. So one doesn't require less spray or more spray than the other. However, in some cases, those hybrids can vary and require, like Matt says, different insecticides, herbicides, whatever applications and needs. But if they're both some format of a triple stack or some format of like some additional added seed technology, you know, but yeah,
Yeah,
Matt,
then you can treat them the same and there's
yeah,
no cost difference and you can ignore
exactly.
that. But if you're sitting down and figuring out, is this seed worth it?
Yeah,
If you're buying two seeds, you need to account for that difference is all we're saying. It's not complicated and I'm sure that everybody does that, but it's nice to be able to sit down and write that down and say, okay, look, I've got to spray, a fungicide on this because this is not
right.
resistant to this particular type of fungal infection. I
Fungus,
mean,
yeah.
and so if that's the case, or if it's going to cost you to do some kind of treatment of some sort, with extra something because of
You
some
have to account
reason,
for that.
that has to be accounted for. And
Right.
that's all we're saying. In this case, none of the varieties that we planted in the TAPS contest were treated any different or had any differences.
Yeah. So number 3 for the comparisons that we used, and again, I think it's important, and it's something Matt's kind of hinted at is you're probably already doing a lot of this, potentially even subconsciously or consciously, is that you're thinking the value of the productivity difference. So again, if hybrid 1 is going to produce 250 bushels an acre, oh, words today, and hybrid 2 produces 260, well, hybrid 2 produces 10 bushels an acre. Now, here's where we all get to pull out our crystal balls and guess what we think the price is going to be, right? At $4 a bushel, that's $40 more an acre that hybrid 2 is making.
Right, which can make a difference, like
Yes.
depending on the cost of the hybrid. So in the case
Yes.
we said hybrid 1 cost $100,
Right.
right?
Hybrid 2 was 120.
Okay, so there's a
Mhm.
$20 difference. So it's $20 more to grow hybrid 2, but at $4 corn
Yeah.
and that 10 bushels, you
You
gain
made it.
$40. So it's
Yeah.
actually $20 more beneficial
Per
to
acre. Yeah.
grow hybrid 2. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not rocket science, and we're not trying to insult anybody by doing the simple calculations. But these are the calculations you can do. And so I think when you sit down and do that, you can do it. And some people may think, well, it doesn't really make that much difference. And that's what we want to talk about next, is we want to talk about this TAPS thing, because
Yeah.
basically we needed to make that comparison for those 20 farms. And we had the yields that they actually had from the different hybrids. But what
Yeah.
we didn't have is we didn't have okay, what if I had grown A1 variety? We're going to use the A1 hybrid.
Yeah.
What if I grown that instead, or the other varieties? What would the cost difference be? And we wanted to get to that because that's what you want to do on your farm, is you want to forecast, okay, what is the difference between growing this variety, sorry, I keep saying that,
Hybrid X versus Y or
versus
whatever.
another
Yeah.
hybrid. And that's what you want to do. So to properly compare hybrids, their performance must be comparable. In other words, you must be able to compare that. In other words, what if I'd done this instead of that?
Yeah.
Okay, so TAPS provided an opportunity to do this because we were able to take the data and information and create a model that represented, if I planted this A1 hybrid, what would my yield be versus if I already which I knew what I got when I planted the B1 or the B2 or the B3 hybrids. And so we're going to show you what we came up with. Okay, and so here's what it is that we used the observations and we created this forecast model. And and it's a pretty good model. It according to statistics and a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to get into that you really don't want to know about. Really, I wouldn't want to know about it anyway. And this is done by using, and then we use the actual levels of irrigation on this model and predicted what it would be had they grown this other hybrid. And we're going to show you the results of that. But first is that the A1 basically had a base yield. In other words, if you didn't do anything. So I'm going to go back here a little bit on the slides and show you something.
Yeah.
If you go back here, where's it at? No, it's ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, there it is, right here. So there we go. It basically, this farm 12, there was no fertilizer or no water added at all, no irrigation. So this would be a dryland situation with the population. So this would be your base yield. So you'd get 137.6 bushels if you had planted this variety and didn't do any of those things. And so that's where this number comes from. Oops, wrong one. Number comes from this 137.62 bushels per acre.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you go, okay, so what about irrigation water? Well, we calculated on average, basically, if you planted the A1 hybrid, you would get 11.6 bushels of corn. So everybody adds different amounts of water depending on what they think or whatever. And so this gives you the amount of corn you would get for every inch of water to that variety. But there's also a penalty. So in other words, water isn't infinite. You just can't keep adding water and expect to get 11.6. At some point, it starts to taper off, and that's
at some point you're going to drown the corn.
Yes,
which
that's
we all
right,
know.
and that's what that's what this other factor is for. Exactly, Shannon. And so this is a negative, but this is we use the squared term of this. So in other words, if you had like 5 bushels, I mean not 5, but 5 inches of water you irrigated, you would square that, which would be 25, and that number 25 you would multiply by this 0.877. Okay, negative 0.877, and that's diminishing returns. And lastly, we had a factor of, okay, so how much fertilizer did you use? So everybody used fertilizer of some kind. So if you use nitrogen fertilizer, we calculated it was, if you use the A1 hybrid, you would get 0.57 bushels per acre. So we did that. Let me give you an example to make it even hopefully more clear and not be more confusing. Take farm 4. They planted hybrid B3, right? They got 248.6 bushels per acre. That's what they actually got. And when we measured when we finished the year, we harvested that much from their 3 plots on average. Okay. They applied 215 pounds of N. Okay. And then they applied 5.6 inches of acre inches of water for irrigation besides the rainfall. Okay. So what we did is the nitrogen added 122.6 bushels. So in other words, as a result of that much nitrogen, they got 122 bushels for the A1 hybrid. Then we multiplied the 5.6 times 11.6 and the square of 5.6 to get
5.6 times 11.6 is 64.8. Sorry, Matt.
No, you keep me straight here. It's 6.48. Then we also did the takeaway, and that was a negative 27.5 bushels because that was 0.877 times the square of this.
5.62. Yeah.
Right. So and it turned out that basically water contributed 37.3 net, contributed 37.3 bushels per acre because of irrigation. And then we get the final thing, which is the base yield of 137. We added these figures together and we came up with 297.5 bushels would be your estimated production or your forecast production if you had planted A1 instead of planting what you did plant, which was B2. And this is for farm 4. So that's how we did it.
But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. So then what we did it for every farm. And so we had the actual yields and the hybrid. And then if they had planted A instead, these would be what we forecasted they would actually end up with in yield.
Yes.
Okay. And as you can see, there's negatives and positives over here. But basically, they're all these that are in yellow are all A1 varieties, and this is what we had, and this is what we predicted. This is what we actually had, and this is what we predicted. They're really close in value. They're off a little bit, maybe a couple bushels, whatever. But the point is, it's really close, and so that we're going to just use it and assume that it's correct. So here's what we did: is that farm 2 had 255 bushels of growing the B variety,
actual yield.
Yeah. And then if they had grown A1, they would have got 288, and so on and so forth. There's only one farm, and that's farm 7. If you go down here, they got 288.3 bushels. But if they'd grown the A1 variety, they would only have gotten 282.2. So they would have actually lost bushels if they'd grown, they lost 6.1 bushels had they grown the A1 variety. So we took all this information, multiplied it times the value of the corn at the time, which was $3.22.
Yep.
Okay. And we came up with an answer. And we're going to talk about that in the middle. But let's go to the answer first, and then we'll come back to Farm 7, if
Okay,
that's all right.
sounds good.
Okay, Shannon, you want to talk about this, or you wanted me to continue?
I can talk about it and then you can take over because I know that
We'll work it out. Thank you, Shannon.
we're good. No. So this is basically the summary of those cost savings and loss. So the cost savings and loss from the different varieties, and here we did not include A1 because A1 is kind of our, again, it's our base model in a way. And Matt, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, and so you wouldn't have a loss or a cost.
No, because it's our 0 in my head. So from a
0,
math
0.
standpoint.
Yep.
So we have farm 2 through 20 basically here. And then again, we have their hybrid number, which is that B1 and through B11. So that cost savings though from the variety switching in the terms of the dollars per acre. So for example, I'm just going to stick with farm number 2 because it's at the top. So it's a loss, or no, it's a difference of $22.53, not a loss.
So it cost you $22.53 more
Yes.
to plant the A1 variety.
Yes.
Got it.
Thank you. So, but the revenue change from the production, the difference is $105.64. So switching, right, the profit, which is really the fun one to look at. I'm an economist too. So I do think of dollars and cents a lot of times in profitability, is $83.11 additionally. Correct, Matt?
That's correct. So in other words, you would, as you just said, you would gain $83.11 if you had planted variety A, not variety, hybrid A versus planting hybrid B1.
Yeah.
So, and that's with the amount of water and all the things that you put on, same amount of water, same amount of everything.
Yeah.
The only difference would be you would have that much more corn at the value that we sold at. That's how much value you would get from changing to that particular hybrid of corn.
Yeah.
And
Can
it's
we
fascinating
talk?
because what?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
All right. So the next one's a little different though, isn't it? Like you actually paid more for the right? You got $10.15 more you paid for for planting B2 than you did the A1 hybrid. But you also you didn't get as many bushels. So you paid more for the seed and you got less yield. Okay, so it's double whammy. And so you end up with $63.29 difference. So had you planted A1, you would have made $63.29 more had you done that. Well, that's a lot of green stuff. That's a lot of cash, especially if you have 1,000 acres. Okay, but the one with the most is farm number 8, which is they also planted the B2 hybrid. Now that means they paid $7 more per acre to plant their seed. But man, oops, I screwed up. Man, I pressed the button. Sorry. This is $166 in value that they lost out on in productivity.
Yeah.
Okay, which is $173.58 total. Now that's at 322 corn. If corn
I
is
think that's
$5 a bushel, that would be a lot more. My point is, obviously, and this is with the same amount of water, the same amount of fertilizer, the same amount of everything, and this is what we estimate they'd be good. There's one farm in here that's interesting, and that's farm 7. I'm going to go back to it.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk about that because I was going to say that's one that, again, when you look at if you have $5 corn or $4.50 or whatever, I was like, it might make a difference. It might be the one to go with then, depending on the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, there's one farm, and it's farm 7, this line right here, farm 7.
Yeah.
It says, okay, look, he paid a lot more for the seed. He paid $23.09. He paid probably one of the most for seed more than anybody else. Well, obviously, the first thing you're going to think, well, he paid so much for seed, there's no way he's going to make money. Well, guess what?
They did.
He lost $19.63 if he had planted the A1 variety. So it's almost a wash. So basically, he would only gain $3.46 from planting the A1 versus what he planted. Now, go back to this page that I was on. I'm going to show this. This is what you were finding interesting, I think.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so this is this farm we were talking about. Basically, he got 6.1 bushels. B6 he got more bushels of corn, than the A1 hybrid. He did better than hybrid by selecting his own, and he paid more for it. Well, at $3.22, 6.1, that's the 1963, which is this value right here. Okay. Oops. And I got to quit pushing buttons. Okay. So this makes the A1 have a greater return. But if the price had risen to $3.79, this $3.79, or if it was $3.79 at the time, B6 would have been a better deal. Because what happens is that 6.1 bushels times the 3.49 means that he would have broke even or done better. So if let's say it was $4, that means that this $19 would have been even a bigger loss value, and he would have made money planting the variety that he had chosen already. So what can we learn from all this? Shannon, you have any thoughts? And I have some, but
I think a lot of producers, again, kind of either consciously or unconsciously do this a lot already when they make some of these decisions. This is just kind of a nice formal mathematical way, calculator, as Matt likes to call them, to look at it and to even compare varieties for yourself. But I think the biggest thing is, you know, us as producers are generally price takers. So like you said, Matt, I really think farm number 7 is very interesting because, again, depending on the year, depending on the situation, you know, they're going to be much better off growing what they grew versus another year. So I don't want to say luck of the draw, but,
well,
you know,
okay.
I think a lot of people make very smart, concise decisions. And I sort of feel like it's proven here to some extent.
Right. Well, they do. But what I think that is important to consider is if you're not, because this is somewhat complicated, meaning you've got numbers involved. And whenever you get numbers involved and you have to calculate a number, it's sometimes beneficial to actually put that number down and think, is this a reasonable number? And then do the actual calculations, because then rather than just shoot from the hip, which is the normal thing to do, and we all do it, because you know what? Complexity is not a human thing we like. No one likes complex things. And whenever you have to take numbers and start adding, subtracting, multiplying, or whatever you got to do to them, no, most people are not, you know, unless you're Einstein or something, that's not, oh yeah, or well, maybe somebody like me who's crazy, you know, you'd have a hard time doing that, but it's not that difficult. So for example, I'm looking at this and I'm going, these people that have these lower values, these the lower cost corn, they probably were thinking the following. And I'm just saying, they not necessarily, but they probably were thinking, they probably had a strategy in mind. And their strategy was, I'm going to pay less for my corn, but I'm not going to really lose that much yield.
Right.
And so they're thinking, well, in that case, I'll go with the cheaper corn. Maybe I'll lose a few bushels, but not a lot. It's about the same as if I planted something else. And as a result of that, they were mistaken and they lost a lot of bushels more than they thought they were going to lose. And as a result of it, they lost out on some money. I mean, $173 an acre. I mean, what could you do with $173 an acre? I mean, I'm sorry, that's a lot of money. So that's a strategy. The other thing is they might have been thinking is because this was the TAPS program, they were thinking, you know what?
Now's the time to experiment.
My friend told me, or my dealership told me that this corn is really good and he wanted me to try it out. And you know what? It's cheap. So let's plant it and see what a cheap corn does. You know? And so as a result of that, they learned that there is a big difference in yield from planting that particular variety. Now, hybrid. That particular hybrid. I got to get this. It's hard for me because I used to truck farm and do stuff, and you always talk about varieties. You don't talk about hybrids. But corn farming, it's all hybrids. Okay, so my point is that's a strategy. Now, how about this person that has these, like this person down here, Farm 20?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they paid $32.28 more for their seed. So what are they thinking, or what might they be thinking? I mean, I don't know for sure.
Maybe it's a really good corn that has all this excellent, I don't know, whatever added into it, and it's a heck of a, like, it's going to give you 300 bushels an acre or whatever. I don't know.
Well, they have to be thinking that the value of that corn
Yeah, it's super high.
gives me more
Right.
either in yield or in risk. I'm
Yeah.
taking less risk. I'm doing something that's benefiting me more than paying for the, $96 thing. So let's go back to that number. And what did they see? They didn't do too bad in yields. They got 272. It wasn't horrible, but they didn't get the highest yield. But if you go back here even a little bit further, let's go to seeding cost. That's the seeding. Well, the
Yes.
seeding cost is quite high. So it's $129. Okay, 31 population. They really bought some expensive corn. I mean, that's where the 32.28 is coming from. It's coming from the fact that they paid $129 an acre, and they're saying that's better than the close to $100. So I don't mind paying $30, more than $30 more an acre, because I'm going to get my value back. Now, some of that could be also brand loyalty. And I think people have to recognize this, that there is a tendency for human beings to decide that, Ford is better than Chevy, or Chevy's better than Ford, or John Deere is green and Case is yellow or orange or whatever color. And Al's Chalmers, which doesn't even exist. Or we could even go with Minneapolis Moline, which we used to call Mini Hopeless, but we won't talk about that. So, but the point is for some reason, they believe that there's $32 more in planting this variety, that it's going to give them something, either some kind of protection, insurance, that it's going to assure a yield in a bad year, or it's going to do something. And that's why they figure it's worth paying for. And they didn't do so bad. I mean, they did lose somewhat. I mean, they could have planted the A1 and got $52 more in productivity, but then they also paid $32 more for it. So they actually basically left $84.59 on the table. In other words, had they planted the variety A1, they would have made $84.59. So
more.
You got to be careful your strategy and what you're thinking. Are you going to cut cost? And when you cut cost, does that mean that you're just going to cut the cost of the seed and that's going to end up hurting in the shorts? Or are you going to be the, premium, corn seed guy and go out and buy the premium seed and say it's worth it? And still, whereas paying attention to your not cultivar, but your hybrid, and finding out how it would work and making an estimate of that. So sitting down and saying, okay, so I would expect 240 bushel from this corn, from this hybrid. But this is a racehorse variety. I would expect, even though it could go as high as 300, I'm only expecting 260. Now you got the opportunity to look, okay, if I treat them the same and everything goes the same, what are my yield differences going to be? And if that yield difference is 40 bushels and corn is worth $4 a bushel, 40 times 4 is 100. What is it? How much is that?
160. You're right.
You're 160. Yeah, it just sounded like a lot of money. 160. I would have $160. I could pay more for that seed and still do the same. If I'm, holding, all inputs constant across and doing that. You see, it's just you need to think about this and think, okay, so when I'm buying my seed, what is it doing for me, and why am I buying it at this price? And if I buy another seed, is it going to give me more production, less production? Going to make me feel better? Does it? And then in this case, does it make me feel $32.28 better to pay more for that corn? Because you certainly didn't get the yields that you were probably expecting. Because if it's that great of a corn, it should have come through at least close to the other hybrid, like this farm number 7, where he paid $23 more, but he got almost the same yield. In fact, even a little better yield. So that's kind of what you got to look at. And sometimes I suppose it's hard to predict exact yields, but I think that a range of yields, and you sit down and figure that out and say, what's the difference in the yields between these two varieties? Not just, one's cheaper or one's more expensive, but, I mean, the problem is we use rules of thumb, like you get what you pay for. I've heard that. How many times have you heard that, Shannon?
Yeah.
A lot?
A lot since
I've
I was
even
little.
said it. Okay, but my point is, yeah, to a certain extent, but price doesn't always relate to ability for production. So you got to look at that and say, okay, what am I going to produce and how much is it going to cost me? And so what's the best corn to buy? Now, having said that, going for the cheap one has the same problem. So you got to find that balance and find out what works for you and make individual choices. And when you see a variety that you think has the potential for the yield and the price is, close or whatever, I would recommend that you try small sections or small parts of that so that you
Yeah.
know how it operates and works on your farm, which probably all of you all do already anyway. But that's
Most
kind
people
of
do.
what I think. Shannon, any comments or thoughts?
No, I think you're right on track with this, Matt. So I was like, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's kind of hard to make the decision sometimes because there's just so much technology and additional factors that are added into some of these hybrids that come out now. Um, and everybody's operation is so unique and different. Yeah, I'm with you and try and do small plots, which, like you said, most folks already do. So,
Well, and I'm sure we're not suggesting any new great strategy that
no,
you
we're
haven't
not
heard.
suggesting anything new or like
Earth
mind-boggling. I
breaking.
don't
It's
think.
just simple stuff. The thing
Yeah.
I remember though is that I remember from an agronomy class that I took at Fresno State, California State University of Fresno, when I was an undergraduate, where the professor had gotten up and we were talking about seed selection, and he was an agronomist, so he's talking about it from an agronomic point of view, not a.
Mhm.
But he basically said, okay, you've done all this ground preparation or a herbicide treatment or whatever you've done, and you prepared the soil and you got all these things you're going to do during the year to make sure that this crop grows well and does well. And then you go out, and of course his thing was cheap seeds, and then you go out and buy some cheap seed that doesn't work good. Whereas if you put a different seed in there that had genetic potential and would have done better, then you optimize what you've grown. But at the same time, you don't want to be paying blue sky for a seed that claims it can, solve all
Do
world
everything.
hunger in 5
Yeah.
minutes and pay a lot of money for it and not get the result either. But what I'm saying is, so you need to be careful in that seed purchase. You need to think about it. Cutting costs doesn't mean paying less for the seed. It means paying less per bushel produced. And that's another thing you need to think about when you're talking about cost. It's not cost per acre that you should be concerned with. It's cost per unit produced. So if you can produce, if you can pay a little bit more than you would in a system and put a little more inputs into it, but yet you get that higher productivity, the cost per unit is lower there
Lower.
than it would be for cutting all your costs and doing this and getting left. And the other thing about sometimes with low productivity, you have some fixed costs that make the cost per unit high because of your productivity level. So you have to have a certain high level productivity level in order to pay for all this overhead and all this stuff you got in farming. So you got to remember that too. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. We hope that you think about your seed decision. We
Yes,
hope
thank
that you
you.
do the best you can and that you pick the seeds and the hybrids that will actually make you rich. We hope that all happens. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome. We have this research.
Feel free to
You can
reach
have a
out to us.
published paper on this
Yeah.
if you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for us? I know that was a lot in a short amount of time, but, and I think kind of like Matt said, it's not anything you're probably not already thinking about in a way. It's just a different way to think about it with actually recording the math and stuff. And like I said, most people are already keeping track of a lot of these records and pieces, and they can easily create this themselves, I think. Oh, yes, thank you. And Ryan put the related article in the chat if anybody's interested.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Matt. And that article is one that
Thank
Matt
you.
wrote last year about just what we've been hearing about today on the webinar. So if you want to dive in more to this, you can check that out. This webinar recording will be up on our Center for Ag Profitability website at cap.unl.edu in a couple of hours probably. So you can check that out on the webinar page. If there are no questions, I want to encourage you as you close out today from Zoom to just take a brief moment to complete a very short survey that you'll be presented with. It'll pop up when you close Zoom. It just helps with offering your feedback for the webinars so we can make sure that we keep providing what people are interested in hearing about. So seeing no questions right now, and if you do have questions, please do reach out if something comes to mind later. But I want to thank again Shannon Sand and Matt Stockton for the great presentation today. And again, this recording should be up later today if you would like to revisit it or share it with anyone. So with that, I think we'll get out of here a little early today and wish you a good Thursday afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. And live long and prosper, so to speak.
Sorry, we do have one question here
Sure.
before we split, Matt. How might a corn producer use this concept regarding a corn hybrid plot yield?
Okay. So if you're going to do plots and you do a plot, of course, you're going to have to estimate what your productivity is on a, per bushel per acre, because that's what you break everything down to, right? So you got this per bushel per acre idea. Well, once you know what your seed cost is on a per acre basis. I mean, you plotted the plot, but you know how many seeds you're going to plant and what they cost, and then your tractor costs and all your other equipment costs for planting. You also have an idea of what your cultural practice is, and if you whatever acres you're covering that over, you could divide that total cost into what it is per acre. So you get everything into per acre cost, and then you have the per acre cost. Well, then if you take another, let's say you did two different varieties, or not varieties, sorry, I keep saying that, hybrids. Well, what you can do then is once you get the yield from those, and you know that the practices, let's say if they're similar, let's just assume they are, that difference in yield, then you would multiply times the value that the corn is worth. So I would pick a value that, you're assuming your marketing is not going to change. So you can pick a value that, okay, I'll pick the value for, December, whatever, whatever that date is, and say, this is the value that I would have sold the corn at. And actually you could just use any value you want. You could use a value, well, I'm going to keep it, and I think it's going to be such and such. You could actually use a range of values. But what you do is you multiply that times the yield differences. The other question you could ask yourself, too, while you're doing this is, how confident am I that this really is a real difference? So if you only do one plot rather than an average of 4 or 5, you might not have as much confidence in it. But if you have a lot of confidence in it, you can just use the number as it is. And basically you just say, okay, I multiply that times the value of the corn. I know what it costs me to, and so I have that difference. So that's that first column that we got here on the screen still, that's the cost of seeding cost difference. So if both hybrids cost the same to plant, the only difference then will be your expected performance or yields times the value of that yield you got. So if one of the hybrids produce 10 more bushels and it's $5 a bushel, you got $50 more value. Now, if that corn, let's say, cost you $20 or $30 more per acre to plant, then you say, well, I got $50 more in corn, or I can expect that, but I got a $30 higher cost. So I still gained $20. So it's the difference between them. So what you're looking for, to be truthful, is a cheap corn that does better than everybody else, because then you make money on both ends. You spend less in planting cost and you gain more in productivity. But that's how I would use it on a plot. Now, if you want and you have numbers and you have plots, I'd be more than glad to work it out with you or for you or help you or whatever it would take. And I'm sure Shannon would do the same.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thank you again to everybody for attending today. And we hope that you have a great Thursday afternoon. You'll join us again next Thursday as we continue our webinar series here with the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thanks,
Bye,
Matt.
Thank you, guys.